Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is the 1619 presentation presented by Pasadena Village. We do this twice a month, and we talk about very interesting topics that affect everybody. Today, we've got a very special presentation coming up. Our friends Dick and Sharon are coming. I met Dick and Sharon through the Coming to the Table organization, which is a national organization that talks about race. And they have some very interesting experiences to tell us about, and they've gained a lot of insights that they'll share with us. And without further ado, and they run, by the way, they run an award-winning progressive newsletter here in this area, and it's called the LA Progressive, and you're welcome to take a look at that and follow some of the things that they report on there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you guys, Dick and Sharon, if you'll take off from here and let us know what you got for us. Are we there? Is Sharon muted?
I can hear you.
No,
Sharon's not muted, but we can't see her video.
we can't see her.
Sharon, are you all right?
She's connecting to audio, it says.
There we go.
Excuse me.
She's muted.
Now she's
She's there.
yeah.
She was alive and well earlier. I don't know.
You guys are muted.
Sorry, we had trouble loading Zoom in our hotel room.
All right, great. Well, the floor is yours. So if you're up and ready, take it away.
Hey, great. So you've allowed us to share screen?
Yeah, you should be allowed.
All right. So hi, everybody. We're Dick and Sharon. And it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. We are currently in Northern California. I don't know if Dick Myers mentioned this. We're attending the national Coming to the Table national conference. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Coming to the Table, but it's an organization where the descendants of formerly enslaved people are meeting with the descendants of former enslavers. We try to work together on issues of reconciliation, racial reconciliation, discovering our roots, bonding, and trying to find answers that perhaps the rest of the country could use.
Yeah, so it's all about our white fragility topic for this presentation. It's right down the center of that.
Right, right. And so my computer's working slow right now. I'm waiting for it. I don't know if you can see on your screen the PowerPoint presentation.
We can see it.
You can?
I have a black
Yes.
screen.
It's just
I
yeah.
have
it's
I have
just
multiple
black.
screens up.
My screen with the presentation simply shows a totally black image.
That's what we see.
Okay, but Priyanka, you say you see a presentation?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, yeah, I can see the presentation, but yeah, it's the actual slide is black. I just thought maybe you needed to
Yeah, for
Okay,
me,
I guess that's my problem too.
the screen is black and there are thumbnails on the left side.
Here comes something.
Yeah, it looks like it's coming back on. Let's wait for
Yeah, we're seeing the PowerPoint, but the presentation hadn't been started.
Yeah.
I'm just getting sort of like a spinning circle, which tells me something is wrong.
Oh,
And I've got a
It's
gray
thinking.
screen.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
well,
thinking.
so while we wait for the presentation gods to do their magic, Dick and I can tell you a little bit about ourselves. We are obviously an interracial couple. We got married. We've been together for 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years. And we were both married to other people. This is not our first go around at marriage. And I was married to,
You were.
that's right, that's right. I was married to a Black man and had children with him. And Dick was married to a white woman. Go ahead, Dick, I'll let you talk a little bit.
Right. So I have a 30-year-old Black daughter. So, and then we've been together for 20 years.
Right, who is adopted. So Dick and his white wife adopted a Black daughter, and then they got divorced, and Dick came into my life when his daughter was 8 years old. So I helped to raise Nia, who is now 30.
So I can tell my little story
You
about
sure can.
my growth into understanding white fragility. I mean, I obviously am a white man. I had a heart for racial justice issues as a kid. One of my favorite memories was when I was 12 or 13. I was going in the far out suburbs of Minneapolis, going door to door with my church group, knocking on doors to raise funds for the Freedom Riders in the South. This was in the early 60s. And occasionally somebody would engage me in a conversation. Rarely would somebody give me a check. More commonly, people would slam a door in my face. So that was that was one little piece of my introductions to these issues. But I will say that one thing that was important for me is the kid down the street. I lived in an ocean of Scandinavians. Down the street, one kid, a year or two older than me, John, was a Black man, a Black boy. We were boys, and he was my idol. He was good at everything, and I tried to follow in his footsteps. And so from 6th grade to 12th grade, I had that friendship at a time that was very formative for me. And then fortunately, I remember I had an English teacher that assigned me James Baldwin's Another Country, or Giovanni's Room, or something. And as a habit that I developed, I read that book, and then I raced through every other book that he'd written. And I really he was my favorite writer. And then when I went to college in New York City at 17 years old, I'm walking across campus, and I see this English professor who I kind of admired. I think I was in his class, and walking next to him was James Baldwin. And the two of them came up out of the blue. I mean, I was just another scruffy freshman. Out of the blue, came up and introduced themselves and engaged me in a conversation, which was delightful. And I had Black friends for all those years. And in the Army, I served with other Black soldiers. When I played on rugby teams, I played with rugby players. But that all changed 30 years ago when I suddenly had a Black daughter, and then 20 years ago when I had a Black wife, which meant I had Black brothers-in-law, Black son-in-law, Black daughter-in-law. More than that, immersed in Black issues, and especially immersed in Black issues because we published a thing called LA Progressive, a daily online social justice magazine, which focuses on the centrality of race. So for 15 years, issues of race have been drilled into my head. And the change for me has been years before I had my wife. When I was a good social justice activist up to a point, I would be alarmed at the headlines. Rodney King being nearly beaten to death, I was outraged. Trayvon Martin killed, outraged again. News of a lawsuit that Black people were being discriminated again, even after Brown v. Education, outraged. But the difference is now being immersed in the Black community with a Black wife, Black daughter, Black family, and doing a lot of Black issues. You'll notice it didn't turn me into a Black person. But what it did, the difference now is it isn't just the headlines that I see, it's the daily, day in, day out weathering that Black people endure. I see that, especially, I began to see that when there would be news of yet another shooting, and Sharon's son would be driving his car to go teach in South LA, and I would see the weight it would put on her. She would be anchored into the couch. There was no direct threat that we knew about to her son, but it was just that worry. And then over time, I began to absorb that deep, that underlying daily agitation. My brother got 5 times in one day going for car parts in Pasadena. The police haven't stopped me 5 times in my life. So I see I see the tension that's right below the surface in Black people that I love. for me before, as a white person, yes, I would have conversations about racial injustice, race, and then the Washington Redskins, and then the next thing. But with Black people, I mean, the issue of Black injustice comes up all the time. It's like a daily, when I see when Black people get together, it's what's for dinner.
Yeah. So thank you, sweetheart. That's what Dick has just laid bare before you is his evolution, being married to a Black woman. He was always a good man. He was always a person that fought on the right side of social justice. That's who his parents were. He lost his parents. I got to know his parents. His dad died shortly before his 99th birthday, 5 years ago, and his mom died a little bit before him. But when I met his parents, I was a little nervous because they're older, much older. His dad, like I said, died shortly before his 99th birthday. And they welcomed me with open arms into their family, and the entire family has been that way. So I could see why Dick was the way that he was. But on the other hand, he still is and was a white man raised in a white city, a white community. And it is impossible, in my opinion, to be white in America and not have been immersed in white supremacist thought, in accepting the racist behaviors of so much of the institutions in the United States, whether we're talking about educational institutions, whether we're talking about hospitals or governmental institutions. There is an acceptance of seeing Black people at the lower rungs of society and not really taking any action.
I have a slight twist on what she just said. It isn't so much I and other white people like me accept and support racism. It's that largely, as I said, in my case, I'm largely oblivious. I don't really, if I didn't know that a Black man would get pulled over 5 times in one day. That didn't occur to me, and now it does.
Right, and so I'm going to talk about the obliviousness and how being in close proximity to each other, how those things came to life. Here's one example. Dick and I had taken Nia, his 8-year-old daughter, to the movies. And we're sitting in the movie theater waiting for a movie that was appropriate for an 8-year-old. And there were all of these trailers for upcoming movies. And one of them was for a martial arts movie. Martial arts, I think Chuck Norris, because this is many years ago. So she's 8, she's 30 years old now. And Chuck Norris is playing, this guy who's coming in and fighting and saving the day. And there was someone sitting behind me. And she said, excuse my language. She said, I'm so sick of this shit. And I turned around to look at her because I knew exactly what she was talking about. And what she was talking about is this white savior movies. So here we have Chuck Norris, who is engaged in some kind of martial arts, and he's working in an Asian community, and he's the one that's coming to save the day. And I thought about my husband and his daughter and how he's oblivious to the subtle ways that we're all indoctrinated into believing that this white superiority, this white man must come into the Asian community and protect them from some crime spree or whatever Chuck Norris was protecting them from. But the woman that was behind me was Asian. And I looked at her and I sort of gave her a thumbs up. But I talked to Dick later on after the movie and explained to him, now, I mentioned that I was married to a Black man before, and I have 2 children by my first husband, and they're Black children. If I was in the movies with my Black husband and those Black children, we would have had a conversation about that. A conversation that is only, we were only able to have that conversation because we're conscious. We can see how white supremacy is taught to us subliminally. So that's an example of how us being together, having an opportunity for me to bring things to him and for him to bring things to me. It was one of the things that I learned by being in his family was this obliviousness. There is a tendency in the Black community to think that white people know this. And I've come to see that, no, they truly are oblivious to a lot of the things that we take for granted that they do on purpose. And they, in fact, are clueless. So here's one thing that you might be clueless to, or you may know others that are clueless to, and that's the FBI hate crime database, that Black people are disproportionately targeted for hate crime since data on hate crime has been collected. Now, when Dick and I were making this presentation, we originally collected these slides about 2 years ago during the George Floyd uprising, the global uprising, and we'd made a presentation at a school where Dick Myers saw it and then asked us if we present the same thing to you. But I added this chart. Occasionally, my husband Dick and I get into disputes, and this was one of the disputes. He said to me that hate crimes are on the rise since Donald Trump and since George Floyd. And I said to him, well, hate crimes have pretty much been what they've been ever since we've been here, but most people aren't paying attention.
And yet the truth is, in the last several years, there has been an uptick, but it isn't even upticking as far as it has been in the past.
That's right.
So understand we were both right.
He wants to be right, but my point is we often want to say that things are getting better. And sometimes in some areas they are getting better, but in so many other ways, they're staying the same or they're getting worse. And so what is it going to take for us to see change in this country, for this country to live up to what it says it's about?
So could I talk just
you
a
want to
second
talk a little bit about that?
Well, just because another friction that we've had in the past, especially early on in our relationship, is, you know, I said things are getting better for Black people. There's a lot of Black people in Congress, the heads of companies, they're succeeding in business. They're, you know, in a way that when I was a kid, you hardly ever saw. I mean, I was around to see Pumpsie Green, the first Black player on the Minnesota Twins or the Boston Red Sox, and now the teams are mostly Black and Latino. But the difference is the thing that that we were missing there is yes, it's true that individual Black people are succeeding now in a way that they weren't able to succeed in the past. But structural racism is as strong as it ever was. That is the kind of thing that denies jobs, denies promotions, denies opportunities, targets Black people for prosecution, fills up our prisons, those kind of things. That structural racism, which is much more significant than almost much more significant than individual racism, that's as strong as it's ever been.
That's right. So why, you know, is race real? Well, recently, scientists, biologists, they've all come to the conclusion that race is not biological. That basically, if you look at our DNA, we're all identical. Racism is not a biological reality. So if race is not a biological reality, what is it? Well, race is a construct. It's a social construct. And it was constructed relatively recently. So they say that the system cannot fail those it was never designed to protect. And so when we talk about systemic racism, what we are talking about is systems that were designed, in fact, to create a racial hierarchy. And so if race is not rooted in biology, but is nothing more than a social construct, the question is, why was it constructed? And historically, we understand that it was constructed so that there could be some people who would benefit basically from free labor. That was why race was constructed. So the historians and biologists agree it's not real, it was constructed, and it was constructed in a very specific period of time. And that period of time was during the early years of slavery. there's this 2-volume polemic written by a gentleman by the name of Theodore Allen. The name of it is The Invention of the White Race. I highly recommend it. This man just delved into all kinds of books for decades, trying to understand when was the white race constructed. And it turns out, if you look through legal documents, the term white, before about 1650, the term white was never even used, because people back then characterized themselves as English or as Dutch or as Spanish or Portuguese. There was no white group where people felt that they were all one monolithic white group. There wasn't one until there was, and that happened because of slavery. So Eric Williams, who was the first prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago, is also a historian. He says, and I love this, slavery was not born of racism. That is, slaves didn't become slaves because of racism. He says race came about because of slavery. Someone needed free labor, and they needed to justify how are they going to stand tall and say it is right for us to keep people enslaved. So they created the races. At that time, Black people, Irish, English, Africans, they were all coming to the New World and working together to develop this new world. They saw themselves as laborers, all working together, living together, eating together, being together, marrying one another. And then suddenly there was an uprising, and it was a powerful and effective uprising. And the powers that be had to devise some kind of scheme to stop these groups from uniting. And they needed to use a divide and conquer technique. And the most ingenious thing they came up with was devising a divide and conquer based on race, something that had not existed before then, uniting all of these different disparate groups, Irish, English, French, uniting them as one, where they never saw themselves as one, and then uniting the Blacks that were from different countries who didn't even speak the same language initially, uniting them as one and placing them at the bottom rungs. And there you have the construction of race, which was a consequence of slavery. So we got into a little bit, talking about slavery. A couple of hundred years have passed. Well, it's been 150 years have passed. And when we get into the 60s, there was a desire to not talk about race at all. And so we've been in this sort of colorblind phase in the United States, and it's really harmed us. It's harmed us because obviously we have a racial problem in the United States. The divisions that have been caused by what was done a couple of hundred years ago continue to keep this country fractured. And it's a fracture that doesn't just hurt Black people, it hurts the entire country. It spills over into our politics. It spills over into just the social fabric of this country. And the colorblind theory helps to promote it. It's sort of like, there's an elephant in the room, but we don't talk about it and we don't see it. I used Jennifer C. Mueller. Her picture is here because she's got a fabulous YouTube, if you want to write her name down. She's a professor at Skidmore College, and she mostly teaches white students about colorblind racism and the harms that it brings. You want to talk about Tanganyika? Okay, so I put this in, there was a book written by a woman who just goes by a single name, Tanganyika. The name of the book is Learning to Be White. And in this book, she offers an exercise to help white people to racialize themselves. So one of the first things that I noticed in being married to Dick and being in Dick's family, so Dick he's a part of my family, which is all Black. I'm a part of his family, which is all white. But when we're together for Thanksgiving with his family, what was striking to me was the lack of any discussion about anything having to do with race. And when he's with my family for Thanksgiving, what was striking to him was that pretty much dominated the conversation, race. I also noticed when we go to our church, we at one time were very active in the Unitarian Universalist Church, which if any of you know of that religion, it's mostly white. And I noticed that whenever we would go to a social gathering with any of our fellow UU members, we talk about a variety of things, but whenever the discussion of race came around, the room would get quiet and everyone would look at me. And I started to say to Dick, we had this little joke between the two of us. I said, oh, of the two of us, I guess I'm the only one that belongs to a race. And that was my first discovery of racializing. What does racializing mean? And it became clear to me that white people do not really see themselves as a race, nor do they see race as their issue. And
I would also say, I mean, it goes a little bit to what I was saying about paying attention to the headlines and being affected by the weathering. As a white person living much of my life in a white world, issues of racism didn't directly impact me unless I read about it in the newspaper or saw it on television. I didn't have a brother who was arrested 5 times in one day for driving around town, you know, but in the Black community, it's on people's mind because it's happening in their community, it's happening to their family, it's happening to themselves. They're getting denied promotions and all the things you can talk about. And to my mind, you know, America won't come close to realizing its potential until it faces up to its racism problem. That it really needs to acknowledge the damage that was done by enslaving a group of people for whatever 400 years and subjecting them to Jim Crow, and even today with this two system of operating society, with white people get advantages that Black people don't. And the tendency, sure, the natural tendency for the dominant culture, the dominant white culture, is to ignore it, because all it means is we're going to lose. We're going to have to do stuff we don't want to do. But as Sharon says, in the long run, that makes us less of a country, less cohesive, less of. We're not even close to that shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan talked about.
Yeah, it just weakens the nation. But the thing that I really loved about this book is that she challenges the white readers to use the word white along with other adjectives when speaking of someone white to another person. For example, you might find it easy to say, you know, I had a Black teacher, my Black teacher taught me this, that, or the other. But when you're speaking of white people, to use the adjective white. And she says that what that does is it sort of opens up something. It opens up your awareness of your resistance to dealing with white as a race, a social construct. Added for sure, Black is a social construct, but to be sensitive to and aware of is sort of the beginnings of an awareness. And I know that, you know, Dick and I tried that, and it was really hard. It was hard to stick to it because white is often it's the norm, it's the unspoken, you know. So when you talk about a group of people, unless they are a racialized group of people, if you don't mention their race, everyone knows that they're white.
Right.
So then came Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. Now, I bought the book immediately. As soon as I heard about it, in fact, I had been watching Robin DiAngelo, her videos. And by the way, I want to talk about being married to him in some ways made me Blacker. And what I mean by that is, I began to notice things that I'd never thought about before. For example, Dick and I are sitting down on the couch watching television. Him being the man, he has the remote control in his hand and he's controlling what we watch. So, and that's fine. He can do it. It is true. So anyway, he's flipping the channels, and we have a fantastic relationship. We spend 24/7 together. And we're always and we're close and we love each other. But I notice I'm sitting there beside him, he's flipping the channels and I can feel my mood changing. And I feel myself becoming irritated. And I'm not quite sure why. I don't say anything to him. I'm trying to think what has happened over the past, I don't know, half hour or so that's changed my mood.
And I can tell you.
What was it, sweetheart?
So what I learned is in a Black family with their Black husband, I know and like, as you're flipping through the channels, a Black person, if a Black face appears on the channel, they'll stop and look at it. And I was not doing that. I was just giving equal time to everyone until we found something we want to watch.
So he's just quickly flipping through and not stopping when you see a Black face, just to find out why is this Black person on television. Now, I am 66 years old, so I've been around for a little while. When I was a child, we hardly ever saw Black people on television. If there was a Black person on television, I'm telling you, everybody stops. Daddy, come, there's a Black person on television. Everybody comes to see. He's just acting like that's nothing.
But one little point on that. So, I say things have gotten better for Black people. And that is one place that it has, because now you watch television, it's all filled with Black and brown and Asian faces, which, and imagine
so
the
much
subliminal benefit that does for young Black and brown and Asian kids. It's something they don't even realize.
So, but back to the white fragility. So I had purchased this book, and I've been gobbling up information because just that revelation for myself, to see how this disconnect between my husband and I, this husband that I love, who I think is my soulmate, yet in some ways we're far apart. So I wanted to understand more. And that's why I would just consume this information. So I knew about Robin DiAngelo way before she published White Fragility. And as soon as she published it, I got the book. And I have literally hundreds of books on the issue of race. Dick was not reading those books, and that was causing a problem for me. So before we did the presentation, this was a presentation that we did 2 years ago. Before we did that presentation 2 years ago, I brought it to Dick's attention. I said, look, we've had that book for 2 years and you've never read it. You've never read any of the books that I have. And it really hurts me. And then he read it. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the very term white fragility is a little hard to swallow. But the basic understanding is what, I mentioned that white people get a pass on issues of race because they don't see the direct impact it's having on them. And the white fragility comes up when white people are urged or encouraged or forced to recognize racial injustice, and it kind of swims around because the racial injustice has a cause, and we white people are the large part of that cause
and the benefit. And so we would have these bumping of heads over racist and white supremacy. He didn't mention just now, which I thought he was going to mention, which kind of made me laugh. He said, well, one of the problems with that book is the word fragility. I don't like that word.
Yeah, I'm a 6'2", 240-pound Vietnam veteran construction worker, and I don't see myself as all that fragile.
I'm like, oh, I see it's an issue. All right, please read the book.
And I did, and I enjoyed it. We had lots of conversations about it.
That was right. So there was a lot of growth, that came out of that. But one of the things that she talks about is the past efforts that we've made as a nation to address the hundreds of years of harm that really have been nothing more than Band-Aids. And we don't really get to the central issues. And so we're going to, and perpetuating this hurts white people as well, which is one of, I don't know if any of you have ever read Heather, her last name is blanking on me, but the name of the book is The Sum of Us. And she is a Black woman, Heather McGee, Heather McGhee wrote a book called The Sum of Us, and what she talks to is how racism hurts white people due to policies that have not been enacted. And the reason they haven't been enacted is because there are many white people who fear that Black people would benefit from these policies. And a story that Heather McGhee tells is swimming pools in the South during the time of segregation, of state-sanctioned segregation, where they had these wonderful swimming pools in public parks in the South. And once segregation was found to be unconstitutional and the parks were open to everyone, the swimming pools were filled with cement so that no one could use them. And we have lots of issues like that, which is why we're having problems getting Medicare for all. I mean, every other.
So Medicare for all, I mean, that's the prime example. You all know perfectly well that all of what they call the first world countries, all of Europe and Japan and so forth, they cut, healthcare is a human right. Everybody's covered. You don't go bankrupt, you don't die because you can't pay for it. And why do we not have it? Supposedly the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world. And I warrant, and lots of people warrant, it's because we have a cadre of unspoken racism that says, oh no, I am not paying for the medical care for Black people. And then they're vilified. They're the what they call the welfare queens, which is just propaganda. But so who does that hurt? Well, certainly it hurts the Black people that aren't getting Medicare for free for all, but it hurts all kinds of white people too. So we're cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Right. So my primary goal is to not learn how racism impacts people of color. Like I said, I'm 66 years old. I'm pretty sure I have a pretty good taste of how racism has hurt me and has hurt my family. But what I'm very interested in is learning how systemic racism hurts everybody, particularly white people. I remember watching a movie. The movie was Roots. And in one of the most awful scenes in Roots, where Kunta Kinte is forced to take the name Toby, and he's whipped and whipped and whipped until he will say that his name is Toby. Well, he kept holding out saying his name was Kunta Kinte, and they keep whipping him almost till he was dead. And in that scene, I look and I see the white people standing around watching this man being whipped. And it occurred to me that we think about slavery and the harms that slavery caused the Black people. But I believe that white people were just as harmed. And they were harmed in one of the ways is their inability to empathize. And I still see that lack of empathy. So that's just one area where white people have been harmed. Dick talked about Medicare and a lot of the social services that all people in the United States should be able to benefit from, but can't because of racism. So that's something that I'm very interested in. This book, The Difference, that was written by Scott E. Page, is really not really about race. It's just about diversity, all kinds of diversity of age, diversity of class, diversity of language, and how when diverse groups come together, they create better groups, better firms, better schools, and better societies. And he is a social scientist. And this book is packed with examples of how when a diverse group tackles a problem, they come up with more efficient and effective solution rather than an homogeneous group. Because the homogeneous group, everybody in the homogeneous group is thinking the same way. Whereas with a group that is made up of a diverse group of individuals, they will have lots of different kinds of input that tends to improve the quality of the output. So Dr. Joy DeGruy, I used to work for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I worked for JPL for 23 years. And that was another place that made me Blacker. So it's a place that I worked with 10,000 engineers and scientists and administrators, and 99% of them were white. And I used to occasionally look for information, trying to understand how they could be so oblivious to their racism. And she talks about the definition of racism. And Dr. Joy DeGruy says that she would go and talk about racism. She'd go talk across the country, and she'd ask people if Black people could be racist. And she'd ask people to raise their hands if they thought that Black people could be racist. As a group, could Black people be racist towards white people? And she said that some people would say yes. Then she asked, well, could white people be racist toward Black people? And they said yes. And so she would say her definition of racism always included power. So she would ask, how many white people have been impacted by Black racism against white people in the area of healthcare, in the area of employment, in the area of education and housing and travel and banking and policing? How are Black racists hurting white people in those areas? And they really couldn't provide any answers. And she says the reason that you can't is because racism is not just prejudice. It's being prejudiced, but having power to enact that prejudice. And that's what systemic racism is. It's power and obliviousness. That's, you can set a system and forget it, and it continues to work. And the reason I had the word Tuvalu up there, and I hope I've spelled that right, is to remind me to tell you the story of the island nation of Tuvalu. The island nation of Tuvalu is an island that exists in the South Pacific, and because of global warming and the melting of the polar ice caps, the water levels have risen on Tuvalu to the point that people are almost always walking in water. And they're at a place where they probably are going to have to evacuate the island. Now, this is an example of how systemic racism, to help you to think of systemic racism. So the people of Tuvalu could rightfully say, we've done nothing to cause global warming. We're a small island nation. We have not contributed to global warming, but the United States contributes 25% because of our use of all of the things that contribute to global warming. So the people in the United States must not care for Tuvalu. The people of the United States are harming Tuvalu, and they're doing it on purpose. And the people of the United States are like, what are you talking about? We're oblivious to what's happening to you. But you see, this is how systems work. You don't have to even know that you're hurting the people. It requires that you learn, you seek to learn, and you seek to find out. And hopefully the people of Tuvalu will not have to evacuate, but so far, the United States is refusing to address the way that it deals with climate change. So what are the threats? So in the 1960s, you know, we had the protests, we had the Rodney King conflagration, which Dick already talked about. We had Occupy. We bring up the Powell memo here because in 1971, in reaction to the civil rights movement, in reaction to the women's movement, the far right started to rise up. And it started with the Powell memo. They were mostly not very powerful back in 1971, but their power is really rising. And we see that 70 million people don't seem to care that, you know, we might have a person who is a criminal and a fascist.
So a little bit about the Powell memo, in case you don't know. There was a lawyer for a business group who
Chamber of Commerce,
who wrote the Powell memo. He later became a Supreme Court justice. And what it did, it laid a very effective roadmap for retaking society from a right-wing perspective. It involved showing up to all the local school board elections, getting elected to all the local offices, creating think tanks, pressuring and invading the universities to make them to get rid of left-wing professors and put more right-wing professors. And we see the flowering that over the years. I broke in here because we're seeing another counter-revolution right now. I mean, now we've got a whole set of politicians campaigning on anti-critical race theory, anti-trans, no history of no Black history in the schools, and that's a big threat, because that can take hold, and so how are people going to know about their history if it isn't taught in school?
Yeah, anti-wokeism.
Right.
You're hearing about this because there's always blowback. And that anti-wokeism and the banning of the books is blowback to the global outcry after witnessing the murder of George Floyd.
Right, but I combined those two, the Powell memo and the current counter-revolution, because the Powell memo was 1972, and it's still having a great impact. And now we're having another counter-revolution, the anti-woke, anti-CRT, that made it's not just this season. It may change the conversation in the country away from improving social justice.
Yeah. So when Dick and I first got married, one thing that caused the clash between us is how we interpreted racism. And I often expressed dissatisfaction about this country's progress based on how much further we needed to go. And he would often challenge me by saying, but we've done so well. Look at how much we've accomplished. And, I would say, look, when I gave birth to my son, I don't want to look at this little baby and say, yeah, I know you're going to have to go through some rough times, but you should have seen what it was like before. So, as a mom, I understand it's important to understand my history, but as a mom, I don't want my son to have any disadvantages based on his race. Anything that is not based on what he can accomplish based on his own merit is what I want to get rid of. And I don't want to tell him, well, we're doing much better than we used to.
So my thing about the glass half full, I try to be a glass half full guy, because I don't work real well when I'm depressed, and I have some history of being depressed. So mostly I look at the world, and I think if we pull together and we work at things, we can make incremental progress and make things better. I used to think that. I'm not quite as positive of that anymore, but that was kind of the disagreement, because if you think that it's hopeless, then you give up, and I'm just not going to give up.
Well, see, I'm not hopeless. I'm not hopeless at all. In fact, being married to you has actually given me much more hope. So, the way that we are together, I'm thinking, well, this is doable. Yeah. This is not too hard for this nation to do, but we've got to engage white people. We cannot look at racism as a problem with Black and brown people. We've got to see this as a national problem. So when expressing my feelings about racism, I'm always thinking about outcomes. And back when Dick and I first started, he would be thinking about intent. Well, no, they didn't mean to do that. Let's forget about who meant to do what. Let's look at the outcomes. And the outcomes and the statistics are saying that on every level, every mechanism that you use to measure well-being, Black and brown people are suffering. So we as a nation need, if we want to be the nation that we say we are, we've got to fix it. And it's got to be a national fixing.
I agree.
So we have plenty of opportunity, and this is where my hope comes from. First of all, it blew me away, and I don't know a single Black person who doesn't agree with this. When we saw the global marches for George Floyd, it made me cry. I think people care, because we know this is happening all the time. What happened to George Floyd was not a one-off. This goes on all the time. As a matter of fact, the Department of Justice reported today Merrick Garland came out in a press conference, some of you may have seen it. The Department of Justice, the federal government completed their investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department, and they found that they need to be under consent decree. So the federal government is going to be watching them because they have a pattern and practice of discriminating against, being excessively brutal with Black and brown people. But the opportunity is the federal government is putting a spotlight on this. Now, that's not the be all end all, because I was asking you, Dick, and I said I wanted you to bring this up. Do you think that that's going to be the thing that finally fixes it?
Well, no, of course, but it's a step forward. I would like to make a different point. So, you know, I'm a little older than her, and I participated in the civil rights movement to some extent, and I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War thing. And ultimately, those great protests, I mean, they ended the way they did. They didn't accomplish all that they were set out to do. But now, 50, 60 years later, I see the same people I saw back in 1968 who are still involved in social action. And my hope is there were 80,000 people on the street of Los Angeles around George Floyd. And the George Floyd protests ended and people went home and they went on about their life. But I think that some cadre of those 80,000 people, their minds were changed, their eyes were opened, and they'll be involved for the rest of their life working for social justice. I mean, that's to me an opportunity.
So what are our next steps? Embracing fragility and fully understanding. That was your bullet.
Well, so I have kind of talked about that because you know, this 20-year marriage, I have a better, I still don't like being called fragile, but I do understand, I do understand the nature, really the real eye-opener to me is understanding this whole business of weathering, that the day in, day out suffering that Black people have to carry, and the fact that my people, my white people are oblivious to it, even though they're really the ones causing it.
Yes. So the proximity, I just put this here because that really opened both of our eyes. And I think that that might be a solution for the rest of the nation.
So where's that picture of you kissing me?
It's right here. So that ends our presentation. If you guys have any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
Well, thank you, guys. I think that's a wonderful presentation, and it makes me think about an awful lot of things. And I think one of the points that you made, Sharon, is that I think is very important and completely agree with. White people are oblivious to the whole idea of racism, and you talked a lot about why that's true. And I think you're right on every point. I haven't had a personal experience not to do with racism. I used to bicycle. Living in Houston, I'd bicycle on a trail. It was about 30 miles round trip. And I had a good time riding. It's all flat. And I'd go out and bicycle and I'd be riding along thinking, man, this bicycling's paid off. I'm getting so much stronger because I'm just cruising along very easily. And then I'd go to the end of the trail and turn around and come back and say, where did this wind come from? This wind is terrible. I'm having to work now to bicycle. And I didn't notice the wind when it was behind me. But when it got in my face, when it was blowing against me, I noticed it right away. And I think that's a, you know, it's a metaphor, I think, for the concept of the white obliviousness. You just don't notice the wind when it's helping you. But when it's blowing in your face, you'll notice it right away. And that's the difference between white and Black experience of racism. And one other thing that struck me, I thought it was funny, the way you reacted to the book about white fragility. And it reminded me of a story I heard. A man and a woman were talking, and a man said, the trouble with women is they take everything personally. And the woman said, I do not. And I wouldn't think of you as fragile, Dick, but it didn't bother me, the idea of white fragility, because I think I see it all the time. And Robin DiAngelo certainly pointed out lots of examples of it in her book. And so I thought that was a fascinating book, reading that book too. So with that, anybody, any other questions from the floor? Anybody have any questions or comments or anything that we've heard today? Just unmute yourself
go
and
ahead.
speak up.
This is Bill, but Priyanka had her hand up.
Oh,
Or
Valerie can
Valerie.
go first though. I can wait.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, I just wanted to say, I love hearing the two different perceptions or views that the two of you explain to us. We don't get to hear, like I hear my side and someone, my white friend hears her side, but to see two people that are living together over not just 2 or 3 years, but 20 years, and she's giving my perspective because we've lived some of those same things. And he's giving the side that I don't have experience with emotionally. So it was very eye-opening. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Priyanka, go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. I guess the two things, like I resonated with a lot of what you guys were saying. Particularly like when you were talking about seeing the like Black people on TV, like when I see, I'm Indian, so when I see like a brown person, like with my mom, my dad, the whole, like now we all would just be like, there's an Indian person on Jeopardy, let's go see, like, so we get really excited in that regard. So I resonate a lot with that sort of thing and I understand that. And just to kind of take it to like a more global scale too, when you were talking about dividing and conquering, like that's something like the British did in India, right? And but it not along racial lines, they went along faith lines with Hindus and Muslims. So it's not like this is such a global topic that everybody should be like aware of, because I don't think people realize this divide and conquer thing, that that we were meant to be at each other's throats. And like if you, so we can all do a lot better. But I thank you so much for talking about this. Like I really empathize with a lot of what you were talking about, or as much as I could.
Yeah, I agree. I particularly like this the way you presented, because there is the personal, intimate part of it. You've touched a lot of bases. The term white supremacy has so much negative image. Everybody, I'm not a skinhead kind of a thing. I've been using the word Eurocentrism, that the default model in this country is Europe, and everybody else is non-European, et cetera, et cetera. And the one-drop theory and all the rest of it. I was raised under Jim Crow in North Carolina. I was an adult when I went to New Orleans in 1950 and 59, and they desegregated the trolley system there. And that kind of stuff, it's a very recent and large part of my life is the direct racism. The indirect racism that continues is certainly part. But a couple of things I would think about. One is using economics as the model for why racism exists, I think doesn't quite go deeply enough. I mean, it certainly is there, no question. But the psychological reason, somebody looks different from me, I'm kind of suspicious of, is something you have to deal with and recognize. The other part is the white fragility, to me, is definitely something, but what it does that's damaging to the overall need to continue to work is it pushes the spotlight away from the group that's being oppressed over to the needs of the oppressor. So it dilutes the movement. Okay, quite a part of however you call it. I don't like the word fragility either. And finally, recognition of the good old term, eyes on the prize. That we're here because of what we want to have happen, not because we don't like what's happening. We are, why are we there? What are we moving toward? Keeps us focused on, and also keeps us positive, not Pollyanna, come by you positive. But yes, I can get up in the morning and think I'm going to do something. The final part of that is recognizing that we do not, there are some inherent ways people separate. And I think of it like, people have heard it, it's not like a revolution where you get to the top and here you are, you're not at the mountaintop. More like a garden. You've got weeds in the garden, you dig them up, you do all the work, you plant the garden, you get the crop, you're good. And guess what? If you don't continue to work, back come the weeds. And set that expectation is then you, again, the whole thing comes down to having the energy to get the work done, recognizing what the work is, and recognizing that intimate part that you all bring out so well, and how very personal it is. It's a wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to sharing the recording to people.
This is Michael Werner. Can you hear me?
Yes,
We can.
yeah, we hear you.
Okay. I'd like to poke at this question about whether racism caused slavery or slavery caused racism. If you look at the analogy with Jews, Jews have been prejudiced against for thousands of years. Okay. And it's a little hard for me to believe that there's been no racial prejudice against blacks until around 1600 or so. Is that because blacks weren't very prevalent or predominant in blacks, unlike Jews, were not very prevalent or predominant in European civilization, or is it that maybe you're overlooking some things, which could be called racist even back in 1,000 years ago?
Right, so before the 1600s, we did not have a Black diaspora, like you have a Jewish diaspora. There was no Black diaspora.
Yeah.
Black people were in Africa. If that makes sense.
No, you hit it on the nail on the head. I mean, Jews were interspersed in communities in Europe, but in a way that Black people weren't until after 1600. I think somebody else.
This is Phyllis. 2
Yes.
points about blacks and being in Africa. Well, there were Africans in Europe working in the households. If you learn about the story of Chevalier in Paris and Marie Antoinette. So I've seen some global traces, and don't forget the Aborigines in Australia. But secondly, I guess we just need to do more research. I'm following up on my PhD research, and I want to share that my uncle and his wife, who was white, never had this type of discussion. And it could have been two things. My family was very silent and very protective of us. So it could have been just to share that or protect us from those realities. But secondly, I think the times have changed. So I want to thank you for your conversation and your frank discussion of your feelings and your experiences, because to me, it's eye-opening. Whenever I see these situations, I'm reminded of my family. And my Aunt Idola was so kind and so loving. That's what she projected, and she left for me to remember. And my uncle, her husband, Uncle James, was also very kind, loving, and patient. So I guess that's something to take away too. But again, I appreciate your honest and frank discussion. This brings up some good points. Thank you.
I want to just mention there's a couple of other things too. There were a couple of papal bulls that were issued. These are declarations by the Pope back in the 16th century. And these were very influential in shaping the movement for colonialism around the world. Basically, what they were doing was justifying the European imperialism or colonialism that was beginning to take place. And that certainly had a racial element. So the racism kind of goes back in a sense to that. Now, the thing that has been brought up by these other two books is the whole concept of the white race and how distinctively that was linked. And it's pretty clear from the historical record that, as you brought out, the terminology and that kind of definition didn't exist until about the 17th century. So it took a while for it to work in, but it does go back a little further. But it was a justification for the Europeans taking over land occupied by other people and claiming that it needed to be taken care of because there was a superiority there. And it certainly had a racial element to it.
This is Linda. It says Village 8, but Linda Pope in Houston, Texas. Thank you so much for such a wonderful, balanced presentation. I think it'll make it a little bit easier for me to talk to some of my fragile white friends. I see the whole racism thing almost exactly as an economic power, colonialistic, imperialistic struggle from Adam to now, and I know that the George Floyd movement was global, and I believe that that may be part of what has galvanized Native Americans. If you watch, they are beginning to rise up and reclaim who they are. And perhaps our battle of being visible now on television and in other places is an incentive, but I wrote a piece, are we there yet? And the answer is not yet. We're getting there, but not yet. Things are better. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank
I
you.
truly enjoyed it.
Oh,
It
I don't
was,
know if you
it was very enlightening in some ways. I'm in an interracial marriage and have been for 47 years. When I first met my wife, she told me that she was liberal. She was a Democrat and that she was a liberal. Well, for all of these 47 years, I have had to educate her about being Black and what it means. Here's an example. We came into our house one night. I turned on the television and saw the lawyers who were for, I can't remember the name of the defendant, but he was the murderer in the Trayvon Martin case.
Yeah, George Zimmerman.
George, right. And the lawyers were smiling. They had gotten him off and everything. Well, I hit the ceiling. And my wife said, "What are you so upset about?" And I realized that I was with a white person who could not understand the horror of what had just taken place. So I called a Black friend and we bemoaned what had happened. And I felt for the first time very alone with my wife, very alone, because she did not understand what my fury was about. So I took another turn, and now when things like this come on television or whatever, or we go to a market and the cashier refuses to believe that we're together, because I believe because of our difference in races, I point out these things to her and I say, I know your heart is in the right place, but your head has to be there too. So thank you very much for your presentation. You've opened my eyes even further.
we enjoyed it. It was good
Thank
to
you.
meet you all.
Thank you.
Gosh, Carol, I didn't realize we'd known each other 47 years, but I was there when you and Cicely met. So we go back longer than I thought. But let me add another thing too, and this goes to what you just said about somebody just said about things getting better. One of the things that I look at and take some hope from is I should say people of color, diversity representation in Congress, because what that means is that positions of power are changing where there is real power. And I think what goes on in Congress will be different because of the representation that people from diverse backgrounds are bringing into the mix. And it takes a while for that to happen, but that's a step in the right direction that I think has some real consequence. And I look forward to seeing more of that. And I'm hopeful about that, but it's not done yet, that's for sure.
So Dick, I think you need to join my glass half full team.
Well, I thought I might help you out a little bit, Dick. So.
You know what I like seeing are the young people, because
Yes.
when I was young, there were separate groups, the different peoples. But now you can go to any country in the world just about, and all the kids dress the same, they have the same hairstyles, listen to the same music, and they tend to be much more, I guess because of things like the internet period, they're more aware of other groups. You know, there's more, I think, intermingling of races among younger people, and they're for good causes too together, like the environment, you know, climate change, whatever, you know, Native American lands, or, you know, the children, things like that. And that makes me feel good. I like to see going down the street, kids of all different colors talking, and, you know, they don't care about your color or your, you know, financial level. They're just all friends.
They have a lot of energy and a lot of connections.
That gives me hope too. I see that as well.
Yeah.
I saw something years ago on television that I've never forgotten. This is probably 20 years ago or so now, but there was a minister from Singapore who was being interviewed on television. And he was asked, how did Singapore, which is a very mixed population there, how did they deal with the issue of people of different backgrounds living together? And so peacefully, because Singapore apparently had a pretty good history of people getting along together. And what he said was that they have a quota system in housing, that all communities have to be mixed. They have to be diverse. And so they absolutely had a quota. Now, this is not something that would work here, but the point was that when people had to work, and these were like people living in the same building or in the same neighborhood from very diverse backgrounds, and they had very practical problems, like how do you get the garbage picked up? And their lesson that they took from that was when people of diversity had to get together to work out practical problems they were all dealing with, they got along better because they all had a common problem that they had to solve and work together. And so that to me was a message about the richness and the benefits of diversity that I keep thinking of all the time, and that a diverse community is a much richer community in so many ways.
You're muted over under the rainbow.
I am here. I was saying that actually has some strong empirical evidence that when people work together on projects, they tend to get better. Not always, but then they have a chance to be close enough to work it out. But it's not dominating the conversation. It can be very stultifying to sit around and have a conversation about race, because everybody gets all, oh, I'm so good about this and whatever. That it's hard to break. But when you actually are shoulder to shoulder, you can be hand in hand and not fist against fist is one way to do it. That's a very powerful thing. There has been an incredible amount of progress in the terms of the whole discussion. What the kids are doing today, I've inherited that, and you can see it in them. They come up. I came up where it was black and white, literally, and that was my background. And my father was on the school board arguing for segregation in our hometown against the one black school board member trying to integrate the schools when I was a young man. So it's a sea change, but the stuff is still there. There's no question about it. The roots are deep and you still have to dig them. But to keep the energy up, I think it's necessary to work together so you know in person, right face to face, that yes, there is something worth working for and we can do it.
Yeah. I'm 71 and I grew up, in the same atmosphere as a lot of people and didn't know too many people of color. Since then, I've worked with, I've dated, married, people of different backgrounds, have relatives with families of different backgrounds. And once you get to know other people, you respect them more. You're not afraid that they're going to take what you have, and you pick up the good things from them. They learn from you. And I think maybe that's part of the reason that younger people are a little more aware of this, because they're able to mix more than we were.
Yeah. And it's not universal. Skinheads are young.
Yeah. They were there, but they were just allowed now to express themselves more.
Yeah. Well,
been in groups here in the village where we were talking about our experience of growing up, and in some of these groups, I've heard people talking about how they grew up, and they were in all white communities, ethnic focused communities, and this is white communities. This was white people talking, And Black people were somebody on the other side of town, very far removed. And these people, few of these people pointed out that they are now, as they reach the age that we are, most of us are, they now have Black family, because the younger people in the family have grown up in a different environment. And so now some of these people who grew up only white environments now have Black grandchildren. And that changes your perspective on things. You know, and that brings it home. And so a lot of these people have talked about how they are now coming to terms with and facing a different environment and adapting to it because they care about their grandchildren. But it's an adjustment to think about it that way. So, but there's the familiarity and personalizing of the relationship that gives people a different perspective. And you got another similar thing to, in my mind, there's the whole outing of the gay community that took place. And when people suddenly realized, you know, what happened there was people would have gays in the family and, oh, that was Uncle Fred, he's different. Yeah. And but then when they got labeled and they started coming out, it says, oh my God, my uncle is gay. And it changes your perspective. It changes the way people think about things.
Yeah, and that's it. What Carolyn brought up, that
Good
gender
point.
identity, sexual orientation, and race mixed in.
Yes, yes.
Just
Well,
accepting
discrimination
people-
is
That's a good point.
yeah, discrimination is discrimination. It's
When you see people on television, I think seeing it in the media and television, that helps to change your perspective. And then, as someone mentioned, in your family, they're at the Thanksgiving table or at family gatherings, that changes your perspective. My family's from Pasadena, Mississippi, and they were very silent. I'm 70, and during my research, I discovered they had demonstrations on Biloxi Beach because the beaches were segregated. I didn't realize that. There was a lot of activism that I'm still learning about, so it took a lot of these movements just to change people's perspective. Whereas before it might be shock and awe, now, you know, we're at the Thanksgiving table together or doing other things together versus fighting over the sand at the beach.
Well, I want to make up, talking about that changes, I want to shout out for the traditions that have been around since the founding. You said Unitarian Universalist Church, for example. New England Universalists were one of the early founders of this sort of attitude. And United Church of Christ, which is Congregationalist and Swiss evangelical in form. It was a Christian traditions that have fostered these for centuries, which is a very important touch point for people to get around. You're not totally alone when you get going. There's a tradition behind it that you can follow.
Oh, do we have any more questions? Because, you know, we're at the national convention for coming to the table. And for those of you who are not, I encourage you to look up Coming to the Table. That's how we know Dick Myers. And maybe you guys will come to Coming to the Table meeting. We can do a collaboration.
For the last several years, we've been meeting on Zoom. We used to meet in a library in Pasadena, and time will go back to in-person meetings. But you'd certainly be welcome, and Dick can steer you to the meetings, or we can.
Yeah. So we've got to get back to the conference, guys.
all right, guys. Well, thank you, Dick and Sharon. This was wonderful.
Yes,
and
Thank you.
this presentation is recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel through Pasadena Village. And you can go to our website, and we have a page called Presentation Recordings that you can find on there, and you can see a link to it right there. It will also be referred to in our next edition of the 1619 blog, which is up on our website. So there are a couple of ways to get to where you can find it. So I encourage you to take a look at it, tell friends about it. You know, what we're trying to do is spread the awareness that comes out. The awareness is where change begins. And that's where we are in the spectrum of trying to do something here. So spread the word, let people know. And if we can educate people, we can bring about the change that way.
Sharon and Dick, I want to thank you. And I also really